Bigfoot at the border. From the Proctor Valley monster terrorizing teenagers to the strange case of the Zoobies of Alpine, reports abound of Sasquatch activity in San Diego County. However, with the urbanization of the area, could these creatures be pushed towards civilization and near people's homes? Investigators aim to find out.
Hottest days they'll be here, the snow they'll be here, and then they're always here.
Welcome back to Mysteries and Monsters. I'm your host, Eli Watson. Now, a couple of episodes ago, I covered Sasquatch in Southern California, and I'm doing the same thing again today, except I'm going to really Southern California. I'm going down to the US-Mexico border, which, shockingly and surprisingly, has Sasquatch reports from that general area. In the state of California, the two counties that comprise the border are San Diego County and Imperial County. So Southern California in general, especially San Diego Imperial County, are not very forested. They're definitely not like the Pacific Northwest at all, because now we're getting into northern Mexico type ecosystems and things like that, which are very deserty. It's not super hospitable. Water year-round is hard to come by. The creeks tend to dry up around May or June. That's when the temperatures start increasing. This time of year, August, it gets really hot. It's taxing on everyone, the people and the animals, everything in this region.
Southern California, with the exception of some of these mountainous areas, is generally not compatible with them because for most of the year, it's too hot and dry. And if there's one thing about Bigfoots is they're gonna need to be someplace where there's reliable running water and where there's shade from the sun if it's hot, and with other food to eat, which specifically deer. Well, there's most other places in the country where you have forest, you're probably gonna have more deer than you will have here in Southern Cal, which doesn't have whitetail, it has mule deer, which are different. The only advantage Bigfoots would have in places like this down here is that it's comfortable in the winter for them in the mountains of Southern Cal, because even if they're at the top, because obviously there's ski resorts at the top, they get snow in the winter, but they can come downslope into warmer temperatures pretty quickly in just about any part of the Southern Cal mountains. Whereas like compared to Minnesota, you go 10 miles in any direction, the temperature and snow level is about the same. You're at the top of these mountains and you go 10 miles, you're gonna be 20 degrees warmer.
Well, Southern California, for the most part, is a dry area. But over the years, I mean, historically, there's been some very wet areas. And so it's a far cry, and it's different in terms of forest density compared to, say, up in the Pacific Northwest. So you can be in either spot and there would be really no mistaking one for the other. Southern California is a lot more arid, a lot more dry, a lot less tree density, probably less wildlife than up in the Pacific Northwest.
You know, we've got the coast in Southern California, but it's so populated that it's not going to be like the coast up in Northern California where there have actually been sightings up there. So inland, you're talking about scrub like this. It does provide a good cover for any animals moving. And then you go further up towards the mountains in Southern California, and that's when you start getting up into the pine forest, which we do have down here. East of San Diego, in the area of Julian and places like that, there are pine forests up there that they're not like the redwoods or the sequoias, but there's enough forest there where something could probably easily make a living there. There's deer and water and stuff. So areas like this with just kind of scrub brush and stuff, as long as the necessities are provided, which are game and water and enough vegetation to provide privacy and to hide them, yeah, we get sightings in all kinds of areas in Southern California. Unfortunately, seems like the last decade or so, we've had drought conditions down here, and when the water goes, so do the Bigfoots.
Because one of the key elements for a natural animal is water for drinking. And now that the place is all drying out and Lake Mead is drying out, it's just like, I'm thinking all wildlife is probably searching for other areas for water.
However, according to the BFRO, there is one report from Imperial County. Imperial County is the least populated county in the state of California, probably because it's a desert. So Imperial County is defined by the Sonoran Desert, the biggest landmark of which is the Salton Sea. I mean, there's like the Borrego Badlands, there's all sorts of fun stuff to do out in the desert, but besides that, I wouldn't really classify the Sonoran Desert as a hospitable environment for Sasquatch-like creatures, which probably accounts for the fact that there's only one report from Imperial County. Now, in some of the other SoCal episodes, I've talked about Sasquatch sightings being in the desert. These sightings occurred in the Mojave Desert, which is further north and is surrounded by mountain ranges. You have the San Bernardinos, the San Gabriels, and so on and so forth, all the way up into the southern Sierras. To me, what's happening in the Mojave Desert is that these Sasquatches, like bears and other creatures, are crossing the deserts to get from one mountain range to the other. The Sonoran Desert is different. The western border of the desert is the Laguna Mountains and the Cuyamaca Mountains. And then south, the desert continues into Mexico, and then to the east, it continues into Arizona, and then to the north, it eventually keeps going until it turns into the Mojave Desert. So, not a whole lot of reason for a Sasquatch to be out there. They're not traversing from one mountain range to the other because there's nothing but miles and miles of desert. This report comes from a truck driver, and he's just outside of Blythe, California, when this event happened to him.
10 p.m. I slowed my semi down going through the mountains when I came to a pullout, and I got out to relieve myself. While I was standing on the passenger side of my truck, that's when I heard a sound of rocks falling. When I looked up, I saw something that I can't describe in words. It ran 20 yards in front of my truck heading east. I jumped back in my truck and drove off. I've never told anybody about this, not even my wife, because I thought people would think I am crazy. I've never drove that highway again at night. What I saw was about 7 or 8 feet tall. It was grayish brown, and what scared me the most was the grunt it made when it crossed the highway.
So just one report isn't super convincing to me. Again, the problem is I don't know what a Sasquatch would be doing out there in the middle of nowhere. Now, since I talked about the one report from Imperial County, I want to move away from that and talk about San Diego County, which, by comparison, is a lot more hospitable than Imperial County. San Diego County has over 70 miles of coastline. San Diego County is also the second most populated county in California with over 3.3 million people. It has mountains that receive snow. Some of these mountains I've talked about before, like Palomar Mountain. It has 16 military installations, including Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton, which I will circle back to in this episode. Outside of the urban centers are the Laguna Mountains and the Chaparral Countryside, Cleveland National Forest, Anza Borregos Desert State Park, and even the western edge of the Sonoran Desert. To the southernmost edge of the county, we have the OT Mountain Wilderness, which sits right on the border between the US and Mexico. This large wilderness area belongs to the Bureau of Land Management. It's a pristine wilderness area, but it's also heavily used by illegal immigrants trying to get into the United States. Because of that, there is the Brown Field Station, a US Border Patrol station. There's a lot that happens in the OT Mountain Wilderness. A lot of stuff that we don't need to get into because this episode is not focused on trying to cross the border. But if you are interested in all the stuff that goes down in that general area, there is a book I would recommend and a book I used for this episode called Out on Foot by Rocky Elmore, who was a Border Patrol agent stationed at Brown Field Station. The book primarily focuses on Elmore's experiences as a Border Patrol agent encountering illegal immigrants and all the drama that ensues from encounters like that. However, he also includes the strange and paranormal experiences that he experienced while on duty. So there's also lots of ghost stories in his book, and curiously enough, what appears to be one Sasquatch-like encounter. This particular event occurred when Elmore was in training, so 1995. So it was him, 2 other trainees, and a field officer went into the OT Mountains, and they were there to work a sensor on a midnight shift. On their way, they met another supervisor named Jeb, who was setting up a scope to monitor a particular portion of the wilderness area, looking for illegal immigrants. I will circle back to Jeb in a little bit. The fog was really heavy that night. In fact, it was so heavy that they actually got turned around in the mountains. I say turned around because they didn't get lost. They knew where to go, and so they ended up marching in a particular direction. While going that way, they ended up paralleling a creek and walking alongside it. And Elmore describes that they heard a large splash come from the middle of the creek, like a rock had fallen from the sky, and everyone stopped to look. Without a word spoken, they all moved towards the creek. As they approached the creek, he described seeing coyotes leaving it, with their ears tucked back and their tails between their legs. The coyotes were completely dry, meaning that whatever had made that splash in the creek was not because of the coyotes. And he describes there was a bad feeling in the area, like a mixture of foreboding and sadness, curiously enough. And everyone had their hands on their firearm, but the field officer had already drawn his, which he describes as not a normal thing to do in any situation. So they reached the creek bank and heard something moving in the creek, although due to the fog they could not see anything in the water. They continued walking, however, and they heard it walking for some time, and eventually their paths parted, but whatever this was didn't make an attempt to come towards them. They didn't hear it leave the creek, so they don't really know what it was. That was Rocky's experience. However, the next morning, they found out there was more that happened that night, and this involves Jeb. Like I said, Jeb was setting up a scope. This scope would allow him to see at night to scan for illegal immigrants trying to cross the border. Supposedly, Jeb thought he saw an illegal immigrant, so he called in 2 agents to intercept him. However, as the agents moved in position, Jeb suddenly called them off. They questioned their orders, and then he demanded that they get out of there, so they left. According to Jeb, what he saw was a large predator. About a year later, Jeb was reassigned to a different station, I believe in Texas or somewhere, and he decided to share the truth of the encounter that happened that night. And what he described was that this large predator was human-like in form, which is why he thought it was an illegal immigrant. But as it moved towards the 2 Border Patrol agents who were going to intercept it, he realized that this was probably about twice their size, that it was the biggest thing he had ever seen. What really freaked him out was how close it was to them, and they did not see it, which is why he ordered them to leave, because he was worried what would happen. That's all Elmore's experience. However, he mentions another story involving a different Border Patrol agent encountering a Sasquatch-like creature also near the border. Now, this report itself is listed on the BFRO. The report comes from 1998, near Boundary Peak, which is just a few miles north of the border. The witness and their friends were out camping without permission and had done a small hike. Due to the time of the year, there was water flowing through a creek, and they crossed the creek barefoot. They went on a hike, they were coming back to camp, and were about to cross the creek again when they noticed a different pair of footprints in the water next to theirs. And although it was similar in size to their footprints, they looked fuzzy and strange, like there was hair around the feet or on the feet. Later that evening, while they were at their camp, a Border Patrol agent stopped to see what they were doing. Eventually, the topic of the tracks got brought up, to which the agent said, "Oh, we call him Littlefoot because the prints aren't big enough to be a Bigfoot. Nobody's seen him though." Then added that it could just be a Mexican with hairy feet. Elmore himself mentions this report and talks about how he tried to get in contact with that Border Patrol agent but didn't have success with doing that. So I guess for now, that report is still a bit of a mystery. However, continuing this trend of reports, I want to talk about some of the sightings that occurred on Camp Pendleton itself. Now, Camp Pendleton is the major West Coast base of the Marine Corps and one of the largest Marine Corps bases in the country. How big? Well, I'm glad you asked. Approximately 125,000 acres of land belongs to Camp Pendleton. The base was established in World War II to train Marines for service for the war. At the time, it was the largest Marine Corps base in the country, and eventually both of my parents ended up stationed at Camp Pendleton, and I was actually born there. Woo! Fun facts about myself aside, there are lots and lots of wide open areas of Camp Pendleton, and each area has a use, but from the outside looking in, it just looks like empty fields and things like that. I know there are parts of Camp Pendleton that actually house bison. There was a joint operation with Camp Pendleton and the San Diego Zoo to try to restart the bison population here in California, and so Camp Pendleton was like, sure, just let them loose, and now there's a small breeding population of bison that live on Camp Pendleton. And so as you can imagine, these empty spaces, these fields that exist on Camp Pendleton are used for training. In the spring of 1982, a witness, a Marine on active duty, was placed in charge of a staff of Marines supervising a youth program that basically acted like a 2-week-long mini boot camp for teenage boys. Apparently, it was a lot of teenage boys too. The number he gives in the report is 300 teenage boys, so it's not like a small little camping trip, it's a large group of people. So after a day of forced marches, they get to an open meadow and start to set up camp. Everyone goes to bed except for the primary witness, who was the last one awake at the time, to keep watch. And it's a relatively bright night, and with his adjusted vision, he turned and saw a tall, bulky figure standing about 50 feet away from the last tent. He got a sense that they were staring at each other, although he could not make out its facial features. He began to get scared, and he felt like this thing was watching him intently, and he couldn't make out the reason why, although he felt like it was because he was the only thing out and about. What frightened him most was how tall and how wide it was. So in order to get a better look, he decided to grab a flashlight from his vehicle. So he keeps his eyes on this thing as long as possible as he moved towards the vehicle. And due to where his vehicle was parked, he had to move out of sight of this thing. So he grabs his flashlight and hurries back, only to find that the figure is no longer there. And he stayed out and waited to see what would happen next, but nothing happened. In the morning, he went to examine the spot where he saw this thing standing, to see if maybe there was a bush there or a tree or something that had caused some sort of optical illusion. However, he didn't see anything at all. And of course, the grass in this meadow was completely matted down already from 300 boys making camp, so it wasn't like he was going to find impressions in the grass either. Now, I don't know. I didn't interview the witness. I don't know all the ins and outs of this story. I don't even know exactly where on Camp Pendleton this occurred. But what I can say is that seems like a very terrifying encounter. And I'm not sure why a Marine would make a story like that up. What's frightening about it is how this thing was just staring at him, completely motionless. And obviously the witness knew it wasn't a person because no person's 8 feet tall and that wide. Obviously not one of the Marines he was in charge of, and certainly not one of the teenage boys. So I can understand his concern, for sure. I just don't know what to make of it. I don't know how to explain away the behavior that's being witnessed here. And as we'll see, there's a lot of things that happen in San Diego County that I don't know how to necessarily explain. And not only that, if these other cases are true, it makes this report even more chilling. Now there's another report from Camp Pendleton that occurred in 1968. The witness was actually interviewed by a BFRO investigator named Kevin Withers, who I've had the chance of meeting and talking to and interviewing about this very topic. So as the story goes, it was during infantry training on some remote part of Camp Pendleton.
I remember they were doing some war games or whatever they call them there, and they had some guys in foxholes at the top of a hill, I guess, or a ridge. And this was at night, and all of a sudden they saw this silhouette of something coming up the hillside toward them, and not a word was spoken or a shot fired or anything said. And this thing, I guess, just kind of looked down on them and walked between two guys in their foxholes and just kept walking. And if I remember correctly, that's what happened in the report. The guy I talked to was very credible and very believable. And Camp Pendleton is not by any means pine forest. It's probably more similar to this than pine forest. But it was really interesting, and the guys that saw this thing were, of course, shocked.
Now, I want to note that the mountains to the northeast of Camp Pendleton are called the Santa Margarita Mountains. These are actually the chain of mountains you can see to the west side of Temecula. I would not describe these mountains as particularly forested, but there's lots and lots of shrubbery, lots of tumbleweed, lots of sage. That's not to say that they're not hard to get through. I mean, I've been hiking up there and it's tough. If you get off trail, you're in it for a while. That's why there aren't really any roads that lead through the mountains. You know, if you're in Temecula, you want to get to the beach, you're not going over the mountains, you're going around the mountains. So the Santa Margarita Mountains eventually connect to Mount Olympus, which is the subject of the second episode of this series. And then from Mount Olympus, that connects over to Palomar Mountain, which I've discussed a lot in this series so far. So Palomar Mountain is famous for its big observatory up on the top there, and was home to UFO contactee George Adamski, which was the subject of the past 2 episodes. But UFOs are not the only strange things seen on Palomar. There seems to be some Sasquatch activity up there as well.
East of San Diego is Palomar Mountain. It is most famous for the big telescope, a 200-inch telescope, which was once the biggest in the world. Now the technology has far surpassed that, but a really, really important telescope for astronomy for many, many years, if not decades. But east of there are a couple hidden valleys and small rancheros and even some reservations that we hear whispers of Sasquatch sighting reports even to this day. That area is very rarely traversed by any outsiders, except for the people who live there. To break into those populations and get that information out might be rather challenging though.
I don't know of any first-hand accounts there, but there are some Indian legends there, Native American legends about a cave, and the Bigfoot's living in a cave up there. A friend of mine was getting gas in Warner Springs and struck up a conversation with a Native American guy, and they started talking about Bigfoot, and the guy was talking about that cave up by Palomar. I never personally went to look for that cave. Today I would. You know, when I was in Southern California starting out my research, I wasn't nearly into it like I am now. Now is a whole nother level up here, so in Washington.
So 1988, there's a couple that's camping up on Mount Palomar. Important to note, you can only camp on designated campgrounds on Mount Palomar, which there's only 3 designated campgrounds. Most of Palomar Mountain is actually like protected government land that you're not allowed to hike on, you're not allowed to get to at all. So there is a large, a very vast chunk of Palomar Mountain that no one ever goes to, ever. And in my opinion, if you could go there, that would be the place to look for Sasquatch, because that's all pretty much untouched land. So this couple is at one of the campgrounds. They don't remember which because it had been so long, and they heard heavy footfalls from what they thought was a heavy man running around their camp. The girlfriend was asleep, so she did not hear, so it was just the man who was hearing these things. And he started to get freaked out because this was just running around their camp. Eventually it ran off, but he was confused as to why there might be a person running around their camp in the middle of the night. This isn't like the most compelling Sasquatch encounter, if it's even a Sasquatch encounter, because who knows, maybe it was legitimately a person running around their camp in the middle of the night. But I also do want to note that a large chunk of the Cleveland National Forest rests on Mount Palomar. Cleveland National Forest is 460,000 acres of wilderness. As I continue to go through the list of reports for this episode, most of the sightings occur within the Cleveland National Forest. However, geographically moving south, we have the La Jolla Native American Reservation. I don't know much about the La Jolla Native American Reservation or any of the bands of natives that live along there, Pama, Paula, Pachanga, all of those bands. I don't know what their thoughts are in terms of Sasquatch, if it even factors into their folklore. I've heard bits and pieces, some rumors of, oh, the natives have legends of XYZ, but I haven't been able to confirm those. But I do know that it was on the La Jolla Reservation that another encounter occurred. So this happened in 1993, and according to a report from the BFRO, the witness was walking along a hiking trail and it opened up to a meadow. He felt a tingling sensation on the back of his neck, and he turned around to look the way he had come. And what he saw was a large creature squatted down in the middle of the path. Then the creature stood up and walked into the brush, making almost no sound in the process. And apparently, it left a single brown turd in the middle of the trail. That's a first for me, a crappy Sasquatch sighting. But yeah, on a more serious note, moving to the east, we have Lake Henshaw by Mount Palomar. Back in the 1950s, Lake Henshaw used to be a huge lake. There used to be lots of fishing. It used to be a very big destination. People would go to Lake Henshaw. Lake Henshaw apparently was so big back then that it stretched from mountain to mountain, covering basically this entire field and meadow that you see on the screen right now, leaving only one point above the water, which was called Monkey Island. The name Monkey Island is kind of mysterious. I don't have super confirmation on where the name comes from. And right, like the first thing you jump to is Sasquatch. At least if you're in the Pacific Northwest, Oregon or Washington, and something's called Monkey Island, it's probably because there's some sort of Sasquatch story linked to that. However, this does not seem to be the case here in Southern California, because supposedly that island was originally called Monk Island, after the monks that lived there along with the Native Americans. And I'm assuming over time the name just morphed monkey, and it became Monkey Island. So that's just a little interesting bit of local information. However, that is not the only reason I bring it up. I had the opportunity to talk to a witness named Brian, who has had several Sasquatch experiences on a property near Lake Henshaw.
Well, I started coming up here and camping, and like the 4th or 5th time, I started to notice weird things. Like we originally had our fire pit over there, and sitting next to it, and we had a barbecue there, and a rock bounced off of it. And then that's when I started thinking like something was up. And then we moved the fire pit over here, and one night there was 3 of us here, and I was like on that side of it just chopping up wood, and my friend has a girlfriend here, and she looked over there, heard a noise, and it was right behind that tree. And it was like 7 feet tall, just staring at us with its eyes, and she screamed, and that thing just took off. A car was right there, and it ran around my car, and I just took off that way, not knowing what I was chasing. And then I had this little cheap flashlight running up the bank, and I was right behind it, and I can hear its legs, it's whooshing, and then chased it all the way up top, and I got into the trees and just went straight into the trees. And then that's when I realized what I was dealing with up here.
So your first thought wasn't Bigfoot?
No, I didn't even really, like, I knew something was up, but that was official. That's when I knew it was, that's what it was.
Did you get a good look at it?
I got to look at his kind of his back as he was going in, but my the one I got the best of is had my car there before all that junk was there, and it was just me and my buddy sitting around the fire at 11 o'clock at night. We're quiet, not making any noise, and he got up to go get his camera to take photos of the night, and walked over there, and then walked back, asked me to come over there with him because it was too dark and he was scared. So I walk over there, and I'm sitting there with my elbow on his car, and he's in the back getting his camera ready, and my car's right next to me, and I can just hear and sense this thing stand up, and I look over, and it just stands up right next to me and just casually walks right by me towards those trees. I yell at my friend, I'm like, crew, there's a giant man out here. And he's like, I hear it. So he gets out and has his phone light on. So we stand in there and we're filming he has the light on, and it goes right behind that tree, and it just peeks his head around. We just see his eyes like bluish crystal. And he was just dead silent, just staring at us, not moving. And I had my arms on his shoulders to line up with the light, and we had about 10 seconds on him like that. And I said, hello, friend, twice, and nothing. So then I told my friend, like, turn the light off, let him go. As soon as he turned the light off, he just walked up back into the trees.
Wow.
Yeah. And then another time we had that little half shed right there. It was right here next to the fire pit. This one was recent. And it was just me, and my friend was in that little camper, so he was kind of out, like he can't hear anything at night, and it was just me out here. Around 3 o'clock, I'm sleeping on my back with my blanket over my head, and I'm a little awake, and then I hear an owl. It started up over there, and it was like, hoo, 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 hoo. It was really deep, so I was just listening to it because I knew it was different. And then another one started up right here. They started going back and forth, and then one right there, and then there was one over there, and they kept going in a circle for about 5 minutes. I was just listening to it, and I had this big glass old tequila bottle right behind where I was sleeping that's been there for a year, and out of nowhere a rock bounced right off of it. So then I was scared just listening to it. And then a couple minutes later I hear this one getting a little closer. I can hear it moving. It's getting closer to this one, and then they just start going back and forth with the noise. And then once they got closer, they just started yelling, like arguing with each other or something, and it just went into full gorilla, just screaming at each other. And then they went to dead silence, and then that was it.
And they were screaming at each other like right over here?
Yeah, just right into the trees right there, and they were really going at it for a second. And yeah, and it was full on gorillas yelling at each other, like they were pissed off at each other. And then it just was dead silence after that and nothing else.
I take it you didn't go over there to look. Yeah, no way.
I didn't take the blanket off my head. And then another night when I was in there, it was around the same time, just sleeping, and something walked right up to me, and it was just staring at me, breathing. And I had the blanket over my head again, and it lasted for about 5 seconds, and I can hear it walk right up, and it was just a couple feet from me, just staring at me, breathing. And then it just walked off. And that was really scary because I didn't know what it was going to do or what it really was, but it wasn't a coyote or a mountain lion. The thing walked up to me, and yeah.
It sounded like it was walking on 2 feet.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
The way it was breathing was heavy, and it was like bent down, like just staring right at me from just a few feet.
Wow. Do you think there's like a family group up here?
Yeah, because that one, they had 4 of them at least surrounding me that one time. So it's not, every once in a while it'll be one, but most of the time there's at least 2 of them. And they mimic animals a lot, like the cows. I've had cows up on my driveway. Me and my friend were playing catch with a football at night right there. Just right on the other side of those trees, a full-on cow just starts going off. And we froze up, and I was just like, okay, there's one down there. And then another time, sitting around the fire, just me and my buddy, and we heard it come up from the top property. There's a pathway that goes to the mountain, and we heard a cow just yell. And that's my property, there's nothing up there. So we did one back, and you could hear it just replied to us, and it started getting closer. We kept doing cow noises back, And then once it got close enough to realize what I was, it started doing something different and it was pissed off. And then it went back up the hill and left.
Wow. I was gonna say, have you casted any tracks or anything?
There was one time in the snow, I walked behind the pond, and my friend broke down the road, so I took the shortcut down there, and I didn't have a phone on me that weekend, and it really pisses me off because it was the only time, and he cut across over the old abandoned road, and it was like a teenager, but it walked straight in a line and just walked right over the road, and it was perfect. And that was the only time. I've seen some stuff in the sand, but out here it's kind of real hard, and it's all weeds and stuff, so it's hard to pick up tracks unless they're walking in the sand. This is where I saw the print. I came out straight out of there and just walked, and I went down and over there. Prints went right across the road in the snow.
Have you found any like tree bends or?
I got one up there. It was fresher before, but right now it's old and it's. I'll show it to you. We'll walk up to the upper path. So you can see the tree bend right there. It used to be a lot fresher.
Oh yeah.
And the pathway used to be right here, a big pathway that animals would use. But that's where it's twisted and bent, and it was newer at one time. That's about the only time I found up here like that. I think they come up through here, and then they went right down into there, and they wrapped around behind me over there. This pathway goes all the way back by the fire pit over there.
Yeah, you can see it. Is that poison oak there?
Yeah.
Let me get in here a little bit. Yeah, you can see that pathway right there. And there's the bend. Wow, that's crazy. That's totally been bent.
When I was a kid and we lived up here, we lived in a trailer up there for a while, and we always had weird stuff happen, but it was all cleared out, and we had some dogs, so it was rare. But we always just thought it was a ghost or something. Like we'd have movie night watching movies in the trailer, and something come up and tap on right behind our heads on the wall. My dad would get out with the shotgun, do a lap, come back in. As soon as we start the movie up, it'd come back and tap again.
Wow.
We'd have stuff like that, but we had no clue what it was at that time.
Yeah.
But
so, had you heard of Bigfoot and stuff, or?
Yeah, I've been always into it.
Yeah.
But I just didn't think they would be out here, and an hour and a half away from San Diego. It's the last thing, and it doesn't have the big forest here, but
right,
they're definitely here.
Sure.
I thought maybe they were a little smaller or something different, but after that one I saw by my car, he was big.
Probably think 7 feet.
Yeah, bigger than that, and just big.
Big.
Yeah. Right there on the side where the fence or his foot would be, and using the pole to climb over for years. And then a couple of those are bent, but those, it looks like someone's climbing over it. There's even a couple more spread out.
Whoa, no way. Wow. That is bizarre.
And that pole's perfectly bent where it looks like a hand, and it's even a little polished more than...
Right, yeah, it's not as rusty.
Yeah.
Wow. That's insane, dude.
There's a canyon down there that could be coming up right there.
You think they're coming up or going down?
Either one.
Because
going up over there.
Wow.
It seems like it's 1 out of 5 chances they'll be here doing something. Sometimes they want your attention, sometimes they're just passing through. And one time we had a tree over there just shaking really hard, and I have the video on my phone. My 2 buddies we go straight into it, we have to see what it is. And that thing, there's 2 of them, and they start walking heavily. And we get to that point over there, and I have my phone light, I'm videotaping with the light on, but you can't see anything in front of your face, it's so dark. And it gets to a point where we freeze, and it's just, they're right on us, and they're not moving anymore, and we're standing there for a few seconds. And then we decided to go to the dock over there. We walk over there, we stand there for like 5 minutes and nothing, so we came back over here. The next day I looked at my phone and watched the video, and when I was filming, we stopped there. There was one just 10 feet in front of me. It looked like he was crouched down because I saw him blink at me. It's just 2 big yellow eyes. And then when I shined it over there was another one behind the tree, and he was standing up and he blinked at me. And I had no clue, we were right next to him, and I had no clue. And that was the tree it was behind, and I didn't know it until I checked my phone the next day. And we were here for about 5 minutes, and it must have just been standing right behind that tree.
This one right here?
Yeah. It just couldn't move because it would have let us know that he was there. It was just standing there quietly.
Wow. Have you ever tried doing any knocks or howls?
Yeah, I do the wood knocks. I got a tree over there I beat on, and I hear them up there about 100 yards. Sometimes they'll just do it on their own, but they don't seem to reply. They just do their own thing. But,
yeah.
Yeah.
They're probably used to you being...
Yeah, they know who I am. They probably see my car coming up the road or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's got to be the same ones because they're pretty comfortable here.
Yeah.
Never reply right away, but maybe something in a couple of minutes. I only hear one. I never do like more than one. These things got me.
Dang. Oh yeah, it got me too.
Hear that?
Mm-hmm.
There's no cow up there. Could be one. Right after the knock.
So, have you ever felt like you were in danger, or?
Oh, this one time, it was the only time I was really, except that one time I was staring at me, but one time I was here early, and I won't come up here at night by myself anymore unless my friends are with me. But I was cleaning up trash, and I had one of those trash things, and I was over there, and on that other side of the trees, I hear this, like someone has metal, and it's like, whoa, 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 like that. And I stopped, and I was like, okay, so I went and did a wood knock. Nothing happened, and then I forget about it, and 20 minutes later I'm chopping wood sitting here, and I hear a noise over there. It cracked, so I kind of looked up, and I'm staring at it through the fire, and I see these yellow eyes just standing in the open back there, and it's just staring at me. And for a couple seconds I'm like, is that real? And then I point at it, and it's like, I see you, just see what it does. And these eyes just gently, smoothly went down to the ground, and then my heart went up my neck, and I was like, okay, that's real. So I called my brother, and I was like, Benny, one's staring at me right now. And I'm scared because my car was parked halfway to it, so I wasn't going to go walk to it. And then while I was on the phone with him, my friend drove up the driveway, and then it left. But I don't know what would have happened if my friend didn't drive up, because it was just me and him. And they don't have a time they come. It's year round. It's hottest days they'll be here, the snow they'll be here. And they're always here.
To me, Brian seems very credible. He's not trying to make Sasquatch his identity. He's not trying to capitalize on this in any way. In fact, I had to do quite a bit of digging in order to get Brian's information. However, I'm incredibly thankful that he was willing to talk about it, because not very many people, there was a witness I talked to for this episode that was not willing to talk about it on camera. He was willing to meet with me and discuss it, but he wasn't willing to talk about it on the record here, which just goes to show you that there's still a stigma around Sasquatch sightings. People see these things, and people have no outlet in order to talk about this without fear of getting ridiculed or losing their job or losing their credibility. Brian also offered the opportunity of allowing me to camp out on the property, which is something I will take up when I have the opportunity to. Now, staying in the Palomar area for a little bit, we're gonna move up to the north side of Palomar, which takes us to Vail Lake, which is actually in Temecula. Vail Lake is named after Walter Vail, who basically established Temecula as a town. The lake itself is a popular spot to go fishing, to go hiking, to go camping, and also had a Sasquatch report. The report comes from Bobby Short's website, Bigfoot Encounters. It was reported in 2011. It was sunset. A man and his family are out there to go fishing, and just to give an idea, you can't drive up to Vail Lake. You drive to a designated spot, you get out and you hike down to the lake, which is about a mile. So they hike down to the lake, they go fishing, and up on a hill, one of them notices what they thought was a man who was there also fishing. But upon closer examination, they realized this person didn't have a pole. He was wearing all dark clothing, including covering his face, and was just squatting there. And they started to get freaked out because the impression they got was that it was just staring at them, completely motionless. And this continued for an hour, and then 2 hours. This thing was just squatted down, staring at them. And it really, really unnerved them to the point where they were yelling at it, and being like, hey, why are you staring at us? What are you doing up there? And no motion, didn't move, didn't do anything. So they ended up taking their stuff and going back up to camp. The following morning, they came back to investigate the area and were like, okay, maybe what we were seeing was just a rock or a tree or a shadow, and whatever it was no longer in the spot.
So I suspect that the thing was down there drinking and was just trying to cool off and wait till nighttime maybe to get out of there. But there's other reports in Temecula, believe it or not. It seems like that place is too arid and too dry, but there are reports online in Temecula itself from back in the day, like 85 and previous to that.
Again, not like the most compelling encounter ever, but when looked at in relationship to the other sightings and the other reports around Palomar and Palomar Mountain, to me it makes sense that a Sasquatch might go down there real quick, but it is a freaky encounter nevertheless. So moving away from Palomar towards the southeast, you'll reach what's called the Legend of the Dead Man's Hole. First reported by James Jasper in the Julian Sentinel, it recounts a story of what's called the Dead Man's Hole. The Dead Man's Hole is basically a spring on the west end of the Borrego Badlands that was actually a stop on the Butterfield stage line. The Butterfield stage delivered mail from, I think, Missouri all the way to California. And so this was a stop in order to get water, fresh water. Dead Man's Hole also abutted a canyon that led deep into the mountains there, which at the time was relatively unexplored. As the story goes, in 1858, during one of these stops, the stagecoach driver gets out to get a drink of water and finds a body of a prospector in Dead Man's Hole. The body was without a head. This event is where Dead Man's Hole gets its name from, in addition to the following events as well. So in 1876, a passenger along the Butterfield stage gets out to get water and said he noticed a dark, hair-covered figure watching him from a bush. When the figure noticed that he had been seen, it turned and walked into the canyon. In 1922, a rancher named Will Blair was found killed, with long finger marks along his neck. A few days later, a young Native American girl was killed named Belita, and she was found, as it's described in the article, as crumpled. So, as the story goes, two men, Ed Dean and Charles Cox, from San Diego, decided that they wanted to explore that canyon behind Dead Man's Hole. After traversing through the canyon for about an hour, they decided to take a break. They heard a commotion crashing through the bushes, and they turned to see what it was, and they described seeing something that looked like a gorilla ascending the canyon wall. They issued a warning shot, to which it turned around and looked at them, and what freaked them out was that the face was human-like. Charles Cox decided to open fire, killed the creature, and it fell down. It was over 6 feet tall with human-like feet, said the facial features resembled closely a Native American, and they had noticed that as it was ascending the canyon wall, that it was approaching a cave entrance. So they decided to investigate that as well. And inside the cave, they found 8 human skulls, a half-eaten corpse of a sheep, and leaves that were bedding for the animal. Now, as compelling as this story is, the article itself was published on April 1st, so take it with a grain of salt. But the reason I tell all of that to even begin with is because maybe that was partially based on some true stuff that happened. So moving east again, we get to the small town of Warner Springs. In the very first SoCal Sasquatch episode, I talk about an encounter that occurred near Warner Springs involving a man named Turner Helm who saw one of these creatures sitting on a rock. It then stood up and turned and walked away. He thought it was some sort of Native American, but it did not respond to anything he was saying. The connection here is that that is very close to Vail Lake, very close to Lake Henshaw. So we're seeing kind of a pattern here of where these things are popping up. So if we continue down the road, we get to another very, very small town called Ranchita.
There's a little town down towards Julian called Ranchita where there's a huge Bigfoot statue. It's kind of a little tourist attraction. I've gone there with my kids and took pictures years ago. But I just find it interesting. I don't know if they're using it as a marketing tool. It's in front of a real estate place, but there's a big white Yeti Bigfoot statue. And it's funny because it's white and the thing's massive. I just think it's a weird place for it to be. But that's not too far from Anza Borrego, where they used to have the Borrego Sandman, which was another Bigfoot type creature in the desert.
When I got there, someone must have put a lei around its head, because I've seen pictures of it online without that lei. Someone probably did that as a joke, not sure why. But it is interesting that the color of the Bigfoot is white. I know a couple of reports of white Bigfoot that come out of Pennsylvania, but white Bigfoot is a pretty rare circumstance. And I'm not sure who made the statue or why they put it up, but it does have some significance to that general area. Because if you stick with me here, we'll move down the hill from Ranchita and we'll enter the Sonoran Desert once again into the Borrego Badlands, where the legend of the Borrego Sandman is. Calling back to one of the previous SoCal episodes, I talked about an LA County sheriff named Ken Kuhn, who spent a lot of his time researching Sasquatch in the Bluff Creek area, but also here in Southern California. Ken Kuhn found a 1964 edition of Desert Magazine that referred to an event that had occurred where a prospector in the Borrego Badlands had come across footprints, these strange human-like footprints that had 4 toes. There were photographs in the article and they were hard to make out, but Ken Kuhn got the feeling that he had seen something similar to these before, and I will circle back to this whole event later in this episode. So Kuhn was also in touch with another researcher named Rich Grumley, who ran the California Bigfoot Organization. Grumley had interviewed a man who had an encounter in the Borrego Badlands back in 1939, in which he encountered several white hair-covered creatures. So even though Grumley had interviewed the witness already, Kuhn wanted to re-interview the witness, and that is what I'm going off of here. I did tell a version of this story in my first SoCal Sasquatch episode, but now that I've found updated resources, I'm going to share what I have learned. The man was alone prospecting, his only company being his donkey, and he had built a shelter into the side of a canyon wall and made a fire at the entrance. He woke up to his donkey freaking out, and as he looked out the entrance of his shelter, he saw a large creature covered in white hair trying to get inside his shelter, but it was having a hard time trying to get around the fire. He said its face was more man-like than animal. He saw it squatted down, but estimates that if it had stood up, it would have been about 7 feet tall, 300 pounds or more. The man built up the fire more, and that seemed to drive the creature back, and when it backed up, he saw that there was other creatures outside his shelter, as many as 4 or 5 of these things. He said the eyes glowed red in the firelight and had large fangs that he could see when it growled at him. The man kept throwing wood on the fire throughout the night until the sun came up, and by that point the creatures had all gone away. So obviously this is a very intense story. Kuhn's read on the whole situation was that the witness was very credible, that he was actually sweating and nervous while telling the story. But what I find interesting is that the coloration of the creatures in this story harkens back to the statue of the Ranchita Bigfoot. And I wonder, with Ranchita and the Borrego Badlands not being that far from each other, if the two are connected in some way. So Kuhn himself did not believe that these creatures lived in the Borrego Badlands. Instead, he believed that they came down from the mountains to the west of the Badlands, like I had mentioned before. The mountain range here is actually a blend of 2 different mountain ranges called the Laguna Mountains and the Cuyamaca Mountains, which are both in the Cleveland National Forest. What's really cool and interesting is that if you're on the eastern side of the Laguna Mountains, you get a very, very good look at the Borrego Badlands below, and you really get a sense of how quickly the landscape changes from this alpine-like forest all the way to absolutely arid desert in the matter of like a mile or two. And you can visually see this with your eyes. It is a very, very rapid change in ecosystems. So I'm out here shooting B-roll and I'm driving to the Burnt Rancherias campground to get a shot of the sign and get a feel for the area, and I'm actually really surprised. I've never been here in San Diego County, but I'm getting some like strong Colorado vibes from this area, which sounds strange, but I mean, I'll put up some footage on the screen, but I feel like this is really prime Sasquatch territory. We're in the alpine zone, which means there's pine trees all around, which I did not expect here in San Diego County. And I'm just amazed at the wilderness that's around here. I mean, look at this. It just doesn't feel like San Diego to me. I've never been here. In my whole life, I have never been here, and this is like an hour away from Temecula. This air also smells amazingly clean. This is great. One famous town in the Cuyamaca Mountains is the town of Julian, which is famous for their pies. It's a quaint little town, pretty fun to go to every once in a while, and it's completely surrounded by forest. In October of 2019, a report was submitted to the BFRO. A couple had gone camping near the town of Julian. The man who reported this to the BFRO explains that his wife got up early every morning to go to the bathroom, and there was these nearby porta potties. So on the first morning, nothing happened. On the second morning, they went to the porta potties together at around 5:40 in the morning, and he heard a knock. When she came out of the porta potty, he asked if she had heard anything, to which she said no. So they go back to their tent, they lay down, and both of them clearly hear a distinct whoop from a different direction than the knock. After the whoop, the birds, which had been silent up until that point, just went absolutely crazy. And they went crazy for like 20 to 30 seconds and then they stopped. So they went back to sleep, they get up, they start talking to the other couple that they were camping with, who were camped in a different tent. The man brought up the knock and the whoop, and it turns out that the other woman had also heard a knock, but it was followed up by two whoops from a different direction from the whoops that the original couple had heard. The man is adamant that these were not coyotes yipping, and I have spoken to the witness, and he is a very outdoorsy man. He is very familiar with the wildlife here in Southern California, as well as Northern California, and if he says it's not coyotes yipping, I would tend to believe him. But no one saw anything, so all we have are sounds. So there's always that realm of possibility that maybe it was a whole lot of nothing. But I would tend to believe that there might have been a Sasquatch or two in the area, especially because of this next report. Now, one of the early researchers of Southern California Sasquatch was a woman named Virginia Louise Swanson. You can see her pictured here with Daniel Perez. This photo was taken back in 1983, so you can get the sense that she was elderly back then, and she has since passed on. She wrote a book called The Night Side of Gold, which was published back in 1978. There doesn't seem to be very many copies around. I've been trying to locate a copy myself, but have been unable to. I've seen online some people say that she might have self-published it and given out copies to her friends, and that it wasn't like a mass-produced book. I mean, hey, if anyone knows anything about that book, let me know, because I want to find it and read it. because according to what I've been able to find, it recounts her experiences with Sasquatch while she was in the Santa Lucia Mountains in Central California working a mining claim up there. To me, that's really fascinating and I would like to know more. There's also supposedly more Southern California stuff that she was looking into that are included in that book as well. But again, I don't know because I haven't been able to look at the actual book itself. So what I'm about to share right now comes through Bobby Short's website, through a researcher named Peter Gatilla, who I've also talked about in the Southern California series thus far. This particular event centers around a Native American reservation in the Laguna Mountains. This article on Bobby Short's website does not specify what exact Native American reservation it was, but I have been informed that it was the Santa Isabel Native American Reservation. Either way, that places it in very close proximity to the town of Julian, where the last encounter occurred.
In February 1981, I happened to be at the right place at the right time to meet a young Indian who talked openly of his interest in Bigfoot and said he had seen him on his reservation and knew the location of caves where Bigfoot hid, and he would take me there, now. He guided me up a fearfully storm-wrecked road. My ancient van was not designed for such, nor my senior years to cope, but once started there was no turning back. Disaster seemed certain, but I would die trying. We reached a small flat. "Park here," my escort said. "Now we hike down a canyon." He hiked ahead rapidly, and I eventually caught up with him, napping under a bush. Below him, a small stream followed a darkened canyon around a bend. I had parked in bright sunshine, and in less than a mile we had descended into sunless gloom. The caves are over there, but I'm not about to go there. Until my guide refused to enter a taboo area, I had not really believed his story. I knew that no money or incentive on earth will induce an Indian to enter taboo ground. "Okay, now we wait. Have a seat," I said to him. "What are we waiting for?" He said, "To watch. He comes out this time of the day and walks around. He drinks from those old rock troughs I showed you by the road. Sometimes he hangs out by that wrecked house where the road loop starts. You in a hurry?" I told him no, but that I was not about to drive back down the road in the dark. We hiked back to my van, which was completely concealed in the brush until you reached the road. It was dusk when I drove out of the reservation. After a week of heavy storms had eased up, I sought out my Indian escort. Unlike before, he was neither friendly nor talkative. Briefly, I was then told, "My people are complaining. Our tribal spokesman is very displeased. You will not be welcome to return, with or without your friends, and trespassers risk being shot." So I backed down for a while, but I was not out. For 3 months, I planned for a return trip. A friend obtained permission from a well-known Indian to drive up the mountain just to take pictures, to stay on the road and not to wander around the reservation. I had studied the map well, but a certain hunch compelled me to request we reverse our direction. After a steep turn, we were blocked, but good, by a heavy pickup in the road next to a parked bulldozer. In front stood 5 Indians, shoulder to shoulder, spanning the road with their backs to us. "Looks like we've got trouble," my escort said, very quietly. He stepped out with a cheery greeting and, as a Forest Service firefighter, was recognized. 2 men approached me. "You see Bigfoot this morning?" They knew who I was. "No, and I came up here just to shake hands with him." That brought welcomed laughter, then a statement, "I have seen him. He comes up from the canyon below the flat you just passed. He doesn't come out very often." This confirmed what my first Indian guide had told me. The sticky situation was smoothed out, but not to the extent that we could continue to explore. I am presently biding my time for the right moment to return.
Going further into the Laguna Mountains, we have a report from July 2012, where another couple was camped out at the Burnt Rancheria campground. The man is awakened by his wife, who needs to go to the bathroom and is scared to get out of the tent by herself. So he's putting on his shoes and he hears what he describes as the sound of an axe splitting wood. But it isn't like rapid succession, it's like 2 to 3 seconds apart each time. This happens about 5 times, and he gets out of his tent, and as he's standing there, he hears what he thinks are voices, echoes of voices, but they're gibberish. They're not speaking a real language, and they're punctuated by these grunts. And eventually it just stops. And he doesn't know what to make of it. And that's kind of it for that story. And again, I mean, most of these encounters are people who are just out there camping. They're not there necessarily to look for Bigfoot. These are just strange things that have happened to them. And to me, that makes it all the more compelling. That report is classified as a Class B report on the BFRO, meaning there is no visual confirmation of what's making these noise. But due to the nature of the noises, we can kind of guesstimate that these are probably Sasquatch. These sightings on their own might not look compelling, or they might not even convince you that these are Sasquatch reports, but given the nature of the history of the area and how much Sasquatch activity I've already discussed within this mountain range in this episode, I think it could be a pretty safe bet to say that that might be a Sasquatch. If we go to the western slopes of those mountains, as they start getting down into the main San Diego area, we have what's called Proctor Valley. So Proctor Valley is on the western slopes of the Jamul Mountains, as well as the northern side of the OT Mountains. Proctor Valley, especially nowadays, is like completely urban. But back then, back in 1968, when this story occurs, was not. The story is attributed to the Chula Vista Star, which reports on local teenagers who are driving around at night on motorcycles and in cars, loaded up with guns. Why are they loaded up with guns? Well, they're trying to kill a monster. Not just any monster, an upright, 8-foot tall, hair-covered creature. Local farmers are complaining that these teenagers are going around shooting their cows. Apparently, 4 cows had been killed by these teenagers who mistook the cows for this large creature, but that didn't stop the teenagers from searching. According to one of them, he and his friend were driving around in Proctor Valley at night when they were coming around a bend, and this creature stood up and threw a boulder at their car, and they proceeded to drive away as fast as they could. According to the article, going even further back, we have a story that local farmers shared with each other, where a man and his family were living out there in Proctor Valley. The man needed to go into town one day to get food and supplies, so he left, leaving his wife and his 2 daughters at home. And when he returned, they were gone, except for piles of blood scattered all throughout the house, and his wife's calico dress torn in pieces all over the ground. That was the original insinuation of the Proctor Valley monster. And in the 60s, it did not take long for people to associate the description of the Proctor Valley monster with Sasquatch. You have to remember, 1968 is only 1 year after the Patterson-Gimlin film. So this is about the time when Sasquatch fever is taking the country for the very first time. Before 1967, Sasquatch, Bigfoot wasn't really a major thing. But people saw the Patterson-Gimlin film. They read the description of the Proctor Valley monster, and they put the two together. Tracks were also found and casts were made. A young man who wished to remain anonymous supposedly saw this creature from about a mile away, followed it for as long as he could until he lost it. And he found a bit of soft dirt where it had left tracks, and they were 3-toed tracks. And there's a photograph that was included in the article. And to me, these just look like bird tracks, not gonna lie. There is nothing in the photograph to insinuate how large these tracks are. So these very well could just be normal sized bird tracks. The article itself says these are large tracks, but it doesn't give measurements. But then the Proctor Valley monster disappeared for about a year and then reappeared on Christmas night, 1970. Where 2 people called the police department to report something strange in their neighborhood. First, a man called saying that there was a hitchhiker that needed to be booted out. He looked dirty and had hair all over his face. And according to the article, the police could hear the wife screaming in the background saying that it looked like an ape. A few minutes after that call, another woman called saying that there was a gorilla jumping up and down in the street. The police arrived. There was no trace of this Proctor Valley monster anywhere. And that, as far as I can tell, is the last time the Proctor Valley monster showed up. But what I find fascinating is the proclivity of the Proctor Valley monster for violence. Of course, these stories are vague, right? But throwing a rock at a car, possibly murdering an entire family. You don't often come across sightings or reports of violent Sasquatch, but sometimes you do. I'm not gonna lie, these San Diego County sightings have been creepy so far. There's lots of staring involved, lots of not moving, and lots of just staring. That's some real stalker-like behavior. If the intention behind the staring was that it was waiting for an opportunity to pounce, that's even more scary. But that is not the end of the San Diego County sightings. In fact, I've saved the best for last. You see, there's an unincorporated community in the Cuyamaca Mountains known as Alpine, California. Alpine is a very quaint little town that I visited for this episode. I had never been there before. This time of year, everything is dead and brown, just like most of Southern California, but during the spring and during the fall, I'm sure it gets greener. It probably looks amazing in the spring. But this case was investigated in the 1990s by Matt Moneymaker.
Ah, the Zuby story. That was interesting. Well, if you read the interview, I did the interview with that sheriff, I think it was back in '91 that I did the phone interview with him. And he was talking about a series of incidents around a home in a town called Alpine in San Diego County. And it was right after there had been a huge forest fire in the highest mountains of San Diego County that had apparently driven a lot of the wildlife out of those tall, high mountains down into lower reservoirs. Well, one of the drainages out of the area where the fire was, I think it's called Sweetwater Creek. But anyway, it's the creek that goes in back of the town of Alpine. So at some point back then, there was just a lot of incidents around this house. And you could read the interview to say, like, the particulars, the interesting stuff that happened there.
Moneymaker interviewed a San Diego sheriff named Doug Hughes. I myself wanted to interview Doug Hughes for this documentary, but I found out that he passed away within the past 2 years, which is very unfortunate. May he rest in peace. Hughes states that he started working in the Alpine region in the year of 1970. He remembers this because he started just after the Laguna Mountain fire, which occurred in 1970, and was the largest brush fire in California history at that time. The witness, Dr. Richard Bador, was a well-known and respected San Diego psychiatrist, and he had bought a mountainside home in Alpine to kind of be a weekend getaway.
As I recall, when it really moved into being an investigation that involved other people and became a case was apparently Bador was driving home and was pulled over by an officer. And when the officer had him roll down his window to interview him, he noticed that there was a sidearm on the passenger seat. And was like, what are you doing with this gun out exposed like that? And he's like, oh, I don't ever go onto my property without it because I've seen these things. Now, apparently, he used a word that the officer either misheard or didn't recall correctly. That in the retelling, this said, yeah, he says he sees something out there like zoobies. So you have to wonder what the original word was, because even the officer in recall was like, I don't remember what he originally said. It was probably something like Yeti or something like that, right? Because Y and Z are kind of close together in the alphabet.
But what was unusual about it is the sheriffs completely believed it, because the guy, Dr. Bador, who was describing what was happening, was a very well-respected psychologist in San Diego. Psychologist or psychiatrist. But anyway, he was an important guy in that field and had a lot of important clients. So the sheriffs tended to believe him to the point that some of them would go hang out on his property when they were off duty. And that's like really a mark that they really think that they're believing you if they're going to spend some of their off-duty time hanging around your house to see one of these things come back.
Dr. Bador described what the zoobies looked like. He said they were large, upright, hairy creatures. On one occasion, Dr. Bador claimed he had seen 3 zoobies at the same time, what he thought was a mother, father, and a child. the father being about 6 feet tall, the mother being about 5 feet tall, and the child 3 or 4 feet tall. Hughes recalls more details of what Dr. Bedour had told him. Bedour had purchased the property from an older German couple.
Apparently they had bought this property from another family who had been there for quite some time and had made some sort of strange suggestions. Like apparently there were these bright yellow halogen floodlights outside. And he told Dr. Bedour, the prominent psychiatrist, whatever you do, don't take these lights down or turn them off. And of course they took them down and turned them off because they were big and bright and ugly. And so in the aftermath of that, there was some activity occurring, some strange things. I think there was irrigation lines and they had fruit trees and maybe other sorts of vegetables that they grew there, but these things would be raided. The fruit trees would be plucked clean at heights, much higher than you would expect a person to be capable of or other wildlife in the area.
Hughes says that there were footprints of the zoobies found, and a plaster cast was actually made. The foot was about 14 inches in length with only 4 toes. Makes you think about the 4 toes that were found in the Borrego Badlands, which are just over the mountains from where Alpine is, so not very far at all. Over the course of time that Hughes knew the Bedour family, they had several sightings. The daughter claimed to have seen one in the bushes as she boarded a school bus in the morning. Another time, their dog had gotten out, and in the dark, they saw something that they thought was their dog. So they called to it, and their dog came around from another corner. And what they thought was their dog was actually a zoobie laying down. And when the dog appeared, it stood up and walked away.
The one story of all of the sightings and the activity that occurred there over this period of time that people might recognize was that they did have chickens on this. It's basically a small ranch. And so apparently, they would go out on a regular basis and feed the chickens and the typical here, chickie, chickie, sort of call, sing song. And one of the stories was that Bedour had gone out to feed the chickens and had seen one of these things, encountered it, and that it mimicked that sound to him. So apparently he had an encounter with a Sasquatch and it said to him, here, chickie, chickie, which is terrifying, it'd make your psyche unravel, you'd think.
And these things have been known to imitate other animals and even people at times with the sounds that they make. So maybe that did happen. That's why I say it's an interesting story. Whether it's true or not, I don't know, but it could very well be.
Shortly after this, Sergeant Hughes left Alpine to become a helicopter pilot, and from there he didn't keep in touch with Dr. Bedour or the family. So there isn't really a conclusion to the story. But fortunately for us, Moneymaker is not the only one who ever looked into the story. In fact, Moneymaker is one of the later additions to the story. The original investigator for this Zoobies case, before it was known as the Zoobies case, comes from Ken Kuhn, who I've talked about already a lot in this episode. Kuhn writes in his book that he was in touch with an investigator named Joel Hurd, who was a Southern California researcher at the time. Kuhn describes Hurd as being in his early 20s with an interest in ecology. Hurd reported that he had evidence that these creatures lived in the mountains east of San Diego and that they had 4-toed tracks, and that a medical doctor who owned a home in the mountains had several encounters with these creatures. So Kuhn and Hurd met the psychiatrist who, Ken writes, wished to remain anonymous. Of course, that all went by the wayside when Hughes revealed the name Dr. Bedour. So if it wasn't for Moneymaker's interview with Sergeant Hughes, we would not have the name of the psychiatrist or the medical professional as Kuhn describes him. So, as the story is recounted in Kuhn's book, the doctor's first encounter with the creature took place shortly after he purchased the property. His wife, his grown daughter, and he himself witnessed a giant monkey-like creature eating from a fruit tree near the house. The creature fled at the approach of the car, and the family returned to the city for the night. The next day, the doctor returned and found 4-toed footprints. Kuhn also recounts the story of him seeing the 3 Zoobies all at the same time, to which apparently the whole family was witness to. And they were standing on just the other side of an electric fence that had been installed to try to keep these things out. The doctor also installed floodlights on top of the house, which he seemed very happy about because that's what essentially kept these things away. Once he installed the large floodlights on top of the house, he had almost no more encounters with the Zoobies, or as he described them, as the monkeys. So it's my personal theory that the word actually was monkeys, not Zoobies. They do sound similar. In Kuhn's book, he mentions that the doctor called them monkeys a lot, not Zoobies, obviously. Kuhn expresses that he trusted the doctor and his family and took them to be credible. He was skeptical of the four-toed tracks, even though Kuhn himself had been involved in finding four-toed tracks. Joel Hurd took Kuhn to another nearby property about 5 miles away from the Badur residence, where a footprint had been found, a four-toed track about 14 inches in length and 10 inches wide at the widest point, that tapered down towards the heel. Kuhn and Hurd and some others spent time camping out in the canyon just behind the Badur property. But nothing really happened, and there's an exciting conclusion to this story. But something to note was that Kuhn actually did notice that every member of the family, when they went outside, carried a loaded firearm. They did not take a chance with these monkeys or these Zoobies. But Kuhn was not the only one who talked about this case. In fact, Hurd ended up writing about it in an issue of Saga magazine in 1975. John Green reproduces this article in his own book, Sasquatch, the Apes Among Us. In this article, we gain a few more details about these creatures, including that it was common to find footprints all over the property, including near the chicken coop. And on one occasion, it had looked like the entire chicken coop had been shifted off of its foundation. What's interesting though, there's been several reports I've talked about in this episode where the face looked human more than ape-like, where according to this article in Saga magazine, these creatures looked much more ape-like than man-like. I wish that we knew more about this case. I wish I knew where that track cast was. I wish I knew if there was photographs taken. I know that Dr. Badur, towards the end of his life, refused to do interviews, saying that he was going to write a book on his experiences, but then he passed away before he completed the book. So that is unfortunate. But what is interesting is the way the story morphs over time, right? Because Ken Kuhn investigated it, John Green looked into it, and neither one of those two sources mention Zoobies. And it's funny because the story is so well known as the Zoobies case now, but that really comes from the final investigation, the final interview. Sergeant Doug Hughes got the final word on the Zoobies case. That was just because it was misheard. It very well could have been Dr. Badur saying monkeys, and it was misheard, misinterpreted, and it became Zoobies, and that's what it is now. So to me, the most accurate source for this information comes from Ken Kuhn, who was there when it happened, and the Saga magazine article, because Joel Hurd is the one who found Dr. Badur in the first place. To me, that's as close as to a primary source document as we're ever going to get. And that's the problem of being a historian, right? Is like, Sergeant Hughes says things that Ken Kuhn does not mention, and maybe that's Sergeant Hughes misremembering things, or maybe it's he knew things that Ken Kuhn didn't know about. I don't know, and I have no one to ask because everyone involved with the case is now passed on.
Through years of investigation, being from the Southeast, I mostly looked at reports in Southern Appalachia, but there was a witness, a claimant, let's say, who had some very interesting claims just west of there, still in San Diego County, but more recent. Things that occurred in the 80s throughout the early to mid 1990s. And along the same waterway, essentially, as the Bedore family. And what they described was another, multi-year sort of repeated visitation, not necessarily habituation as a lot of researchers might think of it, but they lived on this property, and it seemed like Sasquatches moved through occasionally, and every once in a while somebody caught a glimpse. And this person's story was so compelling, and I befriended them. And then that led me to dig into the Bedore story, because to realize you're just down the same waterway from this, not very far at all. Maybe it's the same individuals or related individuals. And it was when I was in the BFRO, a family member of the Bedores, I believe it was the daughter, had reached out to the organization. I think they were looking for Matt Moneymaker, trying to make contact with him. And I always thought, man, it'd be so interesting to interview her, but I never reached out or made contact with her. But I had the chance to go to San Diego just for a brief weekend a few years ago, and thought, well, while I'm in San Diego with a rental car, I gotta find this place. And doing some Googling and some research, I found the address of the property, which is still in a family trust, but at some point the house burned down, so that house isn't there anymore. But I did drive out to that site and get to look around a bit, and it's still private land, and there are neighbors nearby, so I didn't linger too long before I had to be like, oh, hey, I'm here checking out. You guys ever heard of Zoobies? that sort of thing. But it was really interesting to see it, because it really goes against a lot of the fundamental presuppositions that we have as Sasquatch researchers about dense, wet, dark forests and mountains and mist, and this sort of dramatic, almost mythologized version of the North American wilderness, to then be in Southern California and see this very different landscape that's different than what we might expect or predict. And yet San Diego County has such a long history, not just with those two cases, but around Palomar Mountain. There was the Warner Ranch and the Warner Springs stories. I got really fascinated with a lot of that San Diego County history, just because I think there's a lot of insight there of if they do live and thrive there, or at least move through on some regular basis and have for a century and a half or more, then we have a lot to learn about them, because that's not the typical habitat that we expect.
We're talking about a sighting that occurred 53 years ago in 1970. Southern California has drastically changed since then, and I went into this a lot in the first Southern California Sasquatch episode. Just the expansion of the population here in Southern California, it has led to less wildlife, and we've also dried out the landscape. Southern California used to be a lot wetter than it is nowadays. Now it's really chaparral, but before it was a lot swampier. We used to get a lot more rainfall. We used to have just more water here. Looking at everything, if you look and line up all the years to the reports that I've talked about, there seems to be a downwards trend in Sasquatch sightings here in Southern California, and I think it's just because there's less wildlife. Everything's kind of being driven out. And I think there's just less wildlife here in Southern California than ever before. I don't want to get too much into that, but that, I think, could explain why there's less sightings here. But there's also, people just aren't really willing to talk about it. Like the one witness I talked to for this episode, he didn't want to talk on camera about it. He just didn't want to face the ridicule at his work if he was seen in this documentary, which is fine. I understand that. All that aside, it's not going to stop me from continuing to research Southern California Sasquatch. I'm going to follow up for many, many episodes on Southern California Sasquatch, but this is the beginning of that journey, and I'm hoping that this series continues to be compelling and exciting for the viewers. So with all that said, I will see you guys in the next episode. Until then.